majority of human rights around the world. In fact, I'd go as far as to say I was unintentionally part of the problem. I say I was part of the problem because I worked in London as a communications director for a film company with A-list celebrities earning a lot of money. I had no idea about the level of contamination created by the consumer goods industry. My lifestyle also placed a strong focus on ease and comfort rather than equality around the world. I think sometimes when your life is quite high pressured, it's hard to really think about the consequences of your actions on a daily basis. So what changed? Well, the simple answer is I turned 30. Some people call it a midlife crisis, I call it more of a quarter-life crisis, whatever it was. I realised I wasn't really happy and I needed to find out what happiness really was. So I set off with my backpack and a small budget to educate myself in a more unconventional way. I arrived in Peru in Latin America knowing very little Spanish, and I started volunteering at an orphanage full of victims of human rights abuses. I entered the orphanage with a head full of my own problems, but I remember this significant moment when a little boy whose mother had abandoned him due to drug abuse looked me in the eyes with a look so full of unconditional love. It melted my heart, and life started intuitively moving in another direction. I started wanting to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Maybe some of you can relate to this, and you can remember a time when you felt a little lost, but you intuitively found your way by loving somebody deeply. I mention this story because in my personal experience, I found it quite difficult to change my lifestyle until I met the victims of human rights abuses in person, and I saw for myself the challenges that they faced on a daily basis. They stopped becoming a picture on the television or a story on the internet, and they started to become a real person who I had a real connection with, a friend, a colleague, even a mother, as was one of the cases when I was in Bolivia. These experiences is what led me to set up my own charity called The Pursuit of Happiness, where I give international talks and workshops on human rights, balancing your carbon footprint, and mindfulness. This might sound like a bit of an unusual combination, but they actually complement each other quite well. We must be mindful of how our actions are contaminating the planet, so that this contamination does not affect the human rights of people around the world to access clean water, to grow their own food, and to live in a safe environment. Mindfulness also teaches compassionate love. This is really important so that we can have patience with both ourselves and with others in a non-judgmental way to change our habitual patterns. Otherwise, what can sometimes happen is we engage in intellectual discussions, but our actions stay the same. Mindfulness is also very good for breaking down barriers. A study was completed in 2015 by the Central Michigan University, and it showed that mindfulness was successful in breaking down implicit age and race bias. Some of you might think it's a bit unusual that I use the word love, especially in a more political setting, but I think given the gravity of the situation that we're faced with in the world today, the power of humanity is needed now more than ever as we start to delve in quite complex issues of human rights, indigenous rights, and water shortage. And it's genuinely how I feel about other human beings, animals, and the planet. I think if I didn't, I'd find it quite difficult to leave my comfortable life, to live sometimes in quite minimalistic and dangerous situations, helping people around the world. So, if I speak from personal experiences, my daily routine when I was working as a film director in London was really quite mindless, and my head was often in about 10 different places at any one time. I leave the water on while I was brushing my teeth with no idea of how much water I was using and how that was affecting the human rights of other people around the world. I would also take business class flights or leave my computer on while I was in the office. I'd eat in high-end restaurants without really considering whether that restaurant was committing human rights abuses internationally through low pay or long working hours for their workers. Basically, my carbon footprint was through the roof. So if you, So if we look at this slide here, the average, so that you have a little bit of context, the average average carbon footprint of a British citizen is around 13 tons. From the Paris Convention, and what has been stated by many scientists, is that we need to get this down to 2 tons by 2050 to keep the planet underneath the 2-degree level that keeps it in the safe zone. If it goes up above this 2-degree level, we are going to start seeing some big problems internationally in relation to human rights, indigenous rights, and water shortage. So that's why I place a really big emphasis on global warming and climate change, because it's such an important thing that impacts on all of these other things that we're talking about today. So I'm not going to stand here and pretend I'm suddenly the perfect person with a carbon footprint of only 2 tons. That's not the case. But I am much more knowledgeable now, and through mindfulness, I'm much more conscious about how my actions impact on the environment. So, for example, I drove a car here today, that is obviously giving off a carbon emission into the environment. But the way that I balance my carbon footprint, and this is what I teach also in my classes, is when I get back home, I won't use any vehicles or public transportation for the rest of the week. Instead, I'll walk and cycle, and I also won't eat meat. There's always a way of balancing your actions so that you're also considering the planet as well. So another big turning point for me was around 2 years ago, when I decided to take on the challenge of travelling home with no money. I donated my travel budget to help educate slum children in India. I can see the look on some of your faces, it's quite an unusual thing to do. And one of the reasons I decided to do it was because, well, I guess it's more of a social experiment. What it taught me really changed me in ways that I never expected. I basically stripped myself of all of my privileges and forced myself to focus on my basic survival needs. So this was looking for food every day, finding clean water, and finding a safe place to sleep. The most important thing that it taught me was compassion, both for myself and for others. When I was at my best, but also when I was at my worst. After I got home, something changed, and I wasn't ever able to walk past a homeless person or a refugee without at least sharing a smile, because I knew what it was like to be alone on the streets, and I knew how much strength that smile could give. In fact, I wanted to give up many times when I was travelling home with no money, but what kept me going and what helped me get to my own destination wasn't so much the physical help, but all of the words of encouragement and the compassionate love that started pouring through when international media started writing about my story. This is what helped me get to my own destination. Sometimes I'd be walking for up to 14 kilometres with only apples in my pockets. That's the extent of how difficult it was. But this, in addition to mindfulness, which helped me to look within and find strength from within, is what helped me to get to my own destination. So I'd like to try this with you now. I just want to stop for a moment and ask you to observe what your thoughts and emotions are right now in the present moment. Don't worry, I'm not going to put anybody on the spot and ask, but I would like to share with you what mine are. So if I stop and think for a moment, I think there's something quite unique about this connection that we are creating right here, right now, without having known each other before, that makes this ordinary moment really quite extraordinary. I found that when I learned to really love myself, I stopped feeling the desire to buy material items or own more and more. I found happiness in the little wonders of life, like spending time with family or walking in nature. It became more about finding my happiness and love from within, rather than looking for it through external sources. And also confronting my negative feelings, rather than trying to escape them by going to the cinema or some other activity. During my preparations to travel home with no money, I stayed with an indigenous tribe. They were the last hunter-gatherer tribe in the Philippines, and they basically lived from the land using no money. What they told me is that the biggest thing threatening their survival was modern man going into their communities and manipulating them to change for material gain. This would include charities that would go into their community to extract rubber slowly but surely over the last decade started moving them from their original land by the sea further and further into the jungle so that they could use that land for high-end tourist resorts. Also, it included some missionary groups who told them to stop wearing clothes and stop worshipping nature. Whilst I was living with this indigenous community, I also observed how all of these organisations would come in bringing in artificial goods, some of them addictive, like cigarettes, sweets, sometimes clothes, things that slowly but surely moved them away from their lifestyle, living from the land, more towards a dependency on money. The wife of one of the tribal leaders told me they didn't want to change their way of living, but what choice did they have? If they didn't send their children to school for more of a conventional education, they would continue to be manipulated and left with nothing. Although, I also have to state that when I spoke to the younger generations, and I asked their point of view on it, they wanted to live a more modern life and leave the indigenous community behind. So you can see here that some of the members of their own tribe were contributing to their own extinction by choice. My travels in Bolivia led me to see another side of the picture. Bolivia has the highest indigenous population in all of Latin America, but the issues in Bolivia are quite severe. So to support what I'm saying and what I observed while I'm there, I'd like to refer to this interview by this Bolivian gender specialist. So you can see here, it shows that in 2013, Bolivia had the highest rates in Latin America for violence against women, with 9 out of 10 women affected. 87% of the violence that happens within the family, and more cases in rural and indigenous communities are further away. It only became a law in 2013 that a man cannot hit a woman in Bolivia. Now, I worked in Bolivia twice, once in 2013, and again this year with my charity in 2018. I worked both times with the Office of the Social Services. When I returned this year in 2018, it was definitely better, but there's still a really high number of cases of violence against women and children. I remember one situation when I went quite deep into the jungle, to a community quite deep into the jungle, and a woman just broke down crying because she was so grateful that finally they were getting some outside support, and she told me that they felt abandoned with nobody really to help them. So I think this raises a really important point about how much we don't disrupt the way of living of indigenous communities whilst still providing support for victims of violence. Although, of course, this is different for every indigenous group around the world, and there are some communities that don't have any violence in them. So I'd like to look now at the issues. Why is there so much violence in Bolivia? And I think, as you can see at the bottom here, that this gender specialist states, it's the macho culture. This is specifically prevalent in the indigenous communities, which has quite a patriarchal structure. You can see, somewhere stated it shows that 60% of the people, on the second paragraph, it shows that 60% of victims were murdered by their own partner, which the perpetrators explained was due to jealousy. So in the culture in Bolivia, a woman is seen as the property of a man, literally called mi mujer, which translates to my woman, to be taken by the macho man when he pleases. The men also don't have very good control over their primal instincts, so things such as jealousy, hatred, lust. One of my solutions for this through my charity was to work alongside the Office of the Bolivian Social Services in this area against some of these situations. So personally, I think this is really important, that you work as an international body with local communities because they obviously have a deeper understanding of the issues that are there. The psychologist that I worked with was indigenous himself. He was Aymara, so he understood the issues and he understood, how to communicate with the different communities. We work together to teach the communities that we all have the right to have emotions, but though we have the right to have different emotions, we must also respect the human right of other people to live in peace in our actions. So this is where I taught mindfulness, for people to observe their thoughts and their emotions. By doing this, we can start consciously taking control of our unconscious thoughts and feelings rather than acting in a more impulsive way. I also taught self-love, which helps a person move up the pyramid to self-actualization by finding self-worth and authentic meaning to life, living more harmoniously as a community. It's basically providing a resource for the community to find peace at an individual level from within. This is especially important for an isolated community that lives in quite minimalistic conditions. There's no police in these communities, there's no rule of law, other than the tribal rule of law. My approach with the social services was to teach peace from within, so that this could emanate out to the rest of the community. At the end of the talk, I'll talk a little bit more about how effective this was. So in 2006, this was my first travel experience, and I went to Australia and stayed in the Northern Territory, which has a high population of indigenous people. I worked as an investigative journalist here into the issues affecting Aboriginal people, and what I found was that the people were lost, both physically and mentally. During colonisation, they'd been displaced into the towns and were struggling to adapt to a more modern way of life. Instead, they resorted to drinking a lot and drug abuse. I asked a young girl there what she thought the issues were affecting Indigenous people in Australia. She told me it was the prejudice. So she gave me an example about this. The young generation were children of the lost generation. Their parents had been raped, taken from their homes, and separated from their families. They were suffering a lot of trauma and psychological problems, and they had very little support from the government, both physically and mentally. This led them to have difficulties for raising their children, and sometimes what she told me is that a child would go to school smelling of urine because their parents hadn't washed them. And as a result of this, the child would be bullied. And she said to me, in this case, why is the child going to want to go back to that school? Instead, they end up entering this vicious cycle and resorting to alcohol and drug abuse. It's a great injustice what has happened to the Indigenous people in Australia. Rather than being respected and appreciated for the unique skills and knowledge, they have an innate understanding of the vast desert land in Australia and how this barren land, which is unused, can be used for human survival. This could be incredibly useful at a time when some of our biggest problems is a really high population for the planet that we live on, and also the refugee crisis. Rather than utilising these invaluable qualities, they were treated with racism and prejudice and made to feel like they could offer nothing useful to a modern society. So moving away from Indigenous tribes, one of the things that shocked me the most when I travelled around Bolivia, which is the poorest country in Latin America, is the dry lakes and rivers. You can see here in this photo how the town has overtaken nature and the lake has completely dried up. This is the lake in 2013, only 5 years before, and this is the lake in 2018. This had a direct effect on everyday life. So when I was living in the Amazon basin, some days there was no water available. It was really hard to find clean drinking water. It was getting harder to grow food, and with the result of that being that food prices would fluctuate every day, and securing a safe home was also difficult due to the unpredictable weather patterns. In my opinion, this is a responsibility of everybody around the world to lower their carbon footprint and reduce the impact of climate change on the people that are the most vulnerable. As Gandhi once said, you must be the change that you wish to see in the world. As well as trying to change my lifestyle, I also try to do this through my classes by teaching family planning in countries that are overpopulated. This tends to often be developing countries. And then in developed countries, where we have a higher carbon emission due to the modern lifestyle that we live, I teach about how to balance your carbon footprint. It's also about setting a good example. So when I was in developing countries, a lot of people would say to me that we aspire for a life like people in the UK and the USA. So if we place a greater emphasis on consumption, then so are they. And rightfully so, they're justifiably going to say, if it's okay for you, then why isn't it for us? At this point, I'd like to share with you a message that I received from a friend who is living in Brazil as a refugee from Venezuela. I shared my talk with him with the aim of incorporating the point of view of somebody who lives some of these injustices every day. It's in Spanish, but don't worry, I'm going to translate it for you. So it states, you really have unifications and a great human spirituality. You see things differently. If the whole world thought that way, there would be no fight for human and indigenous rights. As you say, one of the big problems is consumerism and materialism. Without that, the greed would not exist, and neither would the poverty. The earth was created with enough to meet our basic needs, but all the countries live a process of transformation to aspire to an educated society and with culture. The United States has an economic blockade against my country. Nobody says anything. My people are dying of hunger. Nobody does anything. Brother countries have turned their backs on the government, and that is why my people are paying with crisis. This international outrage against the president, supported by England, Italy and Japan, is not helping. World powers against a single country. Forgive me, maybe this is not the response you were looking for. The natural world which we are a part of has an organic way of flowing. In its natural orbit, there is no problems with water and food shortage. In my opinion, the problem started when we as human beings at the top of the chain started wanting more, and the first world created an environment where we can live more comfortably, but often in a way that is detrimental to the environment. Previously developing countries like China and India started following suit, and with their large population, it suddenly becomes insurmountable for the fragile framework of the planet that we live on. If we are to stop this impending crisis, we must learn to be happy with what we have and stop wanting more than we actually need. The challenges with regards to preserving indigenous culture, clean water and human rights are growing. However, I believe if we stop judging, fearing and hating and start loving, uniting and caring, we can turn the tide of destruction, instead working hand in hand to rebuild one world without barriers where all human beings are equal and free. This might sound like a bit of an unrealistic ideal, so let me go back to what I promised I would talk about earlier on in my talk, which were the results of the classes that I gave in the Amazon Basin, showing how this can work in practice. So some of the most successful classes that I gave were on self-love and compassion through mindfulness. This successfully reduced addiction to alcohol and aggression. Often, people resort to alcohol when they cannot find peace within. It's an easy way of calming the mind. And people resort to aggression when they find it difficult to feel compassion for another person and see things from their point of view. So basically what I was teaching through my classes was that world peace starts with your peace. It can then radiate outwards to your family, fellow citizens, your country, to an outer might that has no limits. I'd like to finish my talk with another quote from GHANDI, one of the most memorable and inspiring leaders of peaceful liberation in the face of oppression. His approach showed the world that we can overcome human rights abuses through peace and love. The day the power of love overrules